22. We are finishing up our last look today in the book of Joshua. The key verse, which in the theme of Joshua, is to be strong and courageous on the basis that God is with us. And so the call to keep on doing what is right in God's sight, no matter what. As regards the details of the book of Joshua, the book spells out for us how the Israelites came to possess the promised land. For those of you who can see a map, there's a map of different tribes and how their tribal allotments came to be, where they were located in the land. And one of the big lessons of the book, and on top of that, is God always keeps his promises. A number of times through the book of Joshua, there is specific reference that all the words of the Lord came to pass. And when I read that, and when you read that, we are encouraged that when God says he's going to do something, he always comes through. God never fails. God always keeps his word. And so when we think of the promises that await us as the followers of Jesus, one, we walk by faith, not by sight. We can't see God, and yet there is the truth of his word, and there's the promises he's given to us. And so not one of God's good promises is going to fail. Every promise is, the Bible says, is yes in Jesus Christ. The question for you today is, have you ever jumped to conclusions? Yeah. I have. The next slide, please. Have you ever jumped to conclusions? Today's lesson is entitled, The Problem. I found this really cool picture. The problem of jumping to conclusions. And you know what happens when you jump to conclusions? Things don't work well. That's why there's a little guy in a pogo stick, and he's about to go over the edge of this cliff. Jumping to conclusions is to automatically assume something. It's to jump ahead and to believe that you know the results of something without all the information. And so we don't have enough information, but we think we've figured out everything ahead of time. And it often gets us in trouble. This past week, it's funny, whenever you're looking at something specific in the scriptures, it's always sort of highlighted in your own life. And this past week, as I thought about this passage, I realized that a number of times I jumped to conclusions about people's motives or people's actions. For example, one case, I was trying to get a hold of someone who's not here today. I was trying to get a hold of someone by text, but I wasn't hearing back from them when I normally do. And so what do? You think that there's I just assumed that they were mad at me, which made me mad at them. Right? That's how that works, isn't it? We always go into preemptive strike mode, right? We perceive some sort of offense, so then we work ourselves up into a tizzy in our own minds, and so that's unfortunately how we are and how we sin as Christians. But after a few days, I then learned that they changed their cell phone number. Well, there you go. So there was a good reason why I didn't hear from them, was because they had switched their phone number. But you can see what happens when you jump to conclusions. Your mind goes on its own little tour, and we think of all sorts of things, and oftentimes we end up sinning because of that. And yet, when we get the information, then we realize how dumb we've been sometimes. And that plays out over and over again in our lives, where we just go ahead with a lack of information and we end up in trouble. Well, that happens in the book that in the chapter that we're going to be looking at this morning. Total war almost breaks out between the tribes of Israel because of the problem of jumping to conclusions. So take a look with me at this passage. It's a little bit long, but we need to read the whole thing to get closure. Then we're going to walk through the text, and I'll make some comments along the way. So Joshua chapter 22. Then Joshua summoned the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, and he said to them, "You have done all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded, and you have obeyed me in everything I've commanded. For a long time now, to this very day, you have not deserted your brothers, but have carried out the mission the Lord your God gave you." Just a little bit of backstory. Back in, I think it was Numbers 32, you can see, if you go back one slide, if you see on that, the Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben, they wanted that land on the other side of the Jordan because they had lots of flocks and herds, and so when they had been attacked and had conquered the people that had attacked them in that area, they said, "Well, Moses, we'd like to stay here, actually. This looks like awesome land." Moses initially misinterprets them and thinks that they were trying to get out of the responsibility of conquering the land, and so he's ticked at them. But then they're like, no, we actually will lead the charge in the promised land. And so a deal is struck where they get to keep that side, that land on that side of the river, in exchange for them headlining the forces in the conquest and not going home until all the tribes receive their inheritance. And so 7 to 10 years have now passed. They had left their women and children in the fortified cities in those areas, and they had been away all those years. And so here is Joshua. He calls them and says, you know what, you're now relieved of duty, and by the way, you've done an awesome job. And so that's the context that's here in these verses. And so now the Lord has given, you can go to the next one, thank you. Now the Lord has given your brothers rest as he promised, and so return to your homes in the land that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you on the other side of the Jordan. But be very careful to keep the commandment and the law that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you, to love the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to obey his commands, to hold fast to him, and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. And so then Joshua blessed them and sent them away, and they went to their homes. And to the half-tribe of Manasseh, Moses had given land in Bashan. To the other half of the tribe, Joshua gave land on the west side of the Jordan with their brothers. Now when Joshua sent them home, he blessed them, saying, return to your homes with your great wealth, with large herds of livestock, with silver and gold and bronze and iron, and a great quantity of clothing, and divide with your brothers the plunder from your enemies. And so there's a little message there, share of the bounty. That's not just for you, share with everyone when you get home. Which is a good reminder to us to be people who are generous and share of the things that God has given to us. And so the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh left the Israelites at Shiloh in Canaan to return to Gilead, their own land, which they had acquired in accordance with the command of the Lord through Moses. And here's when things take a little bit of a turn. When they came to Geliloth, near the Jordan in the land of Canaan, the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh proceeded to build an imposing altar there by the Jordan. And so when the Israelites then heard that they had built this altar on the border of Canaan at Geliloth, near the Jordan on the Israelite side, what happened? The whole assembly of Israel gathered at Shiloh to go to war against them. And so the Israelites, just before they pull the trigger, verse 13, the Israelites, however, then sent Phinehas, son of Eleazar the priest, to the land of Gilead, to Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. And with him they sent 10 of the chief men, one for each of the tribes of Israel, each the head of a family division amongst the Israelite clans. Now when they went to Gilead, to Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, just so we don't confuse ourselves as to who they went to, they said to them, the whole assembly of the Lord says, how could you break faith with the God of Israel like this? How could you turn away from the Lord and build yourselves an altar in rebellion against him now? Was not the sin of Peor enough for us? Up to this very day, we have not cleansed ourselves from that sin, even though a plague fell on the community of the Lord. And now you're turning away from the Lord. Now, just so you know what they're referencing there, remember when Balaam was hired to curse the Israelites, but God made him bless them instead 3 times? Well, then before going back home, Balaam gave this little counsel to the kings of Moab. He's like, you know what, I know how you can make them fall. God has forbidden me from blessing them, but if you want to corrupt them, send over all your women to avail themselves to the men of Israel. And so at Peor, that's what happened. The result was God sent a plague, and about 24,000 Israelites died because of that incident. And so here we are. They are accusing the 2.5 tribes of sins worse than some of the worst sins in the history of the Israelite nation. And so one of the things we'll talk about is how do you respond when someone accuses you of stuff that's not true, right? Because these are like fighting words. They roll into the camp and they're like, you are guilty of some of the worst crimes that have ever been committed against God. And they list as an example this particular sin that happened before. Then they say, if you rebel against the Lord today, tomorrow he will be angry with the whole community of Israel. If the land you possess is defiled, come over to the Lord's land. Now there's a little bit of in there in that comment. Lord's tabernacle stands, and share the land with us. But do not rebel against the Lord or against us by building an altar for yourselves, other than the altar of the Lord our God." And then he cites another bad incident in their history. "When Achan, son of Zerah, acted unfaithfully regarding the devoted things, did not wrath come upon the whole community of Israel? He was not the only one that died for his sin." Now, in response to this, then Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh replied to the heads of the clans of Israel, "The